So we're still kind of wrapping up the fine-tuning argument. And so last time well, let me just ask you guys, this is kind of the point of all this. What is the fine-tuning argument? Fine-tuning argument. Just give it to me as it's stated in the book.
Oh, then don't know it exactly. I can't quote it.
Give me the rough version.
Everything about the universe is so precise that the possibility of it having is so impossible that there has to be some designer of some sort.
Okay, all right. So the way the argument's stated is it talks about, well, first of all, the way that he has it stated in here, like we said, is doing an end run around all the evolution debate and all that stuff, because he's talking about the fine tuning of the universe, right? So we talked about how there's initial conditions and constants that have to be so precisely fine-tuned. Like, for example, the idea of gravity. And remember, there was it's 10 to the 60th, to a degree of 10 to the 60th. So 10 with 60 zeros in it. So I heard it described one time that if you went from one end of the universe to the other and you measured it in inches, right? That if the gravity was off 1 inch, then it would be a life-prohibiting universe. Right? Either the universe would collapse back in or expand it too rapidly. So think about that. It's like 14.3 trillion light years in diameter or something like that, they think. So if you divided that into inches and if you moved it 1 inch, right? And again, part of what we talked about last week is, well, how do people account for that don't want to acknowledge that it was designed that way? Because that's just not gravity. There's gravity and the cosmological constant and all these other factors that you just pile improbability on top of improbability. And the point that we talked about last week is that those numbers don't have to be that way. It's not like, well, it's highly unlikely, but that's the way these numbers have to be. They don't have to be. So remember we talked about there's a specific number, that gravitational constant is a specific number. Why is it that number? It seems to be strange that it could be, and then they said it's wildly more improbable that it's not that number. And so we talked about the example of if you were standing in front of a wall in front of a firing squad of 100 trained marksmen and they all shoot at you and no one hits you. That cries out for some kind of an explanation, because that shouldn't happen. And that's kind of the idea of the design argument. We shouldn't see what we see. It's not like it has to be. So that's why the argument's phrased the way that it is. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either, what were the three options?
Necessity,
chance,
or
design, right? And so the argument is that it's not due to necessity, because none of those things have to be that way. In fact, it's highly more likely that they're not that way. And it's not due to chance, because we said you multiply the probability by you know how do you figure out probabilities? You do that in math, right? So if I have a 5 combination lock, and each number has from 1 to 10, so then you multiply, it's 10 possible things times 10 possible things times 10 possible things times 10 possible things. So that's the total number of possible options of the lock, right? And so that's what we're saying. You take the gravity thing and you multiply it by all these other constants and quantities, and you're like, all right, that's strange. And it doesn't have to be that way. And again, and I want to deal with evolution stuff today a little bit, just to talk about, because like we said, he's doing an end run around this by just talking about the universe. So the universe, and even the reality of this is that the problem is so significant that what have non-believers posited as an answer to get around this? Remember, how do they avoid the problem of fine-tuning?
That there's going to be a theory of everything that'll explain it later, but we just have to wait.
Okay, well, but even that theory of everything won't explain
right.
why those constants are what they are, right?
Like you don't need an explanation or something like that.
Wasn't it we don't know?
That was the big, we don't know, but how do they try to reduce the improbability problem? That's the specific one I want to talk about. Like, because like they'll acknowledge that this is not something that just the Christians, or just the like religious people, like this is hard science. So there's no way to get around this. Like they know this is an issue. So what have they posited to try to kind of do an end run around this? And it was something we talked about when we did the video from the atheist.
Oh, the multiverse?
The multiverse, right? Why did they have to bring up the multiverse? Like, first of all, is there any evidence at all for multiverse? No, right? So it would seem to be strange that all of a sudden you're like, well, there must be an infinite number of universes, right? Well, why did they go there?
Because they say if there's an infinite number of them, that there's a chance that we're just in the one.
Right. Does that make sense to everybody? So if there's an infinite number of universes, then it's not surprising that we find ourselves in this highly unlikely situation, because there's got to be an infinite number of universes. So we're just have to be in the one that works, right? But even what was the problem that he had in the video with the multiverse itself?
It still needs an explanation.
And it needs an explanation, and even more specifically,
A creator?
it would require a high degree of
Fine-tuning.
fine tuning, right? And that's like you have to. It almost takes more design to have a universe generated than just the universe, because you have to be able to generate multiple universes, so just one.
Where are they getting that universe generated? Are they
Well, that's the-
like they're just there?
That's the problem. So the funny thing is when you talk, like, I don't know if you talk to people about this ever, but if you watch videos on YouTube and stuff, they'll just talk about the multiverse as it's like this is a settled fact. Like, oh, the multiverse, and then they just move on. And it's like, whoa. You can't just move on there. Like, first of all, do you have any evidence for the multiverse? And then the multiverse itself would require the design. So that's just kicking the can down the road, right? Like at some point we have to deal with why is this the way that it is, okay? So does that all make sense? The next chapter is about the moral argument, which I find the most interesting personally. Only because it deals with everyday life stuff. Like most of the time you're not talking about fine tuning of the universe with friends, right? Like, but it's good to have this in your pocket, right? So I want to show you a couple of videos that I think are kind of helpful in regard to all this stuff. First one, and I think he has, just see. Yes, he does, okay. I want to make sure that the clip itself is embedded in here. So, Neil deGrasse Tyson, you ever see him? He's an astrophysicist. And like he does, they have these masterclass videos. You see the commercials for those? And his masterclass thing is like, the danger is that, when you think you know something about something, but you don't know that you don't know. And he's going to try to teach you how to think and all that sort of stuff. And
Well, what if you don't know?
it's like that. That's what I mean.
Yeah, what if he doesn't know that you don't know that I don't know?
The same thing, because the assumption is that he's got it all figured out somehow. And it's like, well, how did you figure it all out? Well, and I don't think he has it figured out. So usually I don't like to say stupid, like we teach our kids, and stupid is not a nice word to say. Right? So I'm not condoning the stupid thing. But he's in his argument, he's saying that if this was designed by somebody, then the designer was stupid. That's what he's saying, right? So that's why the guy's saying, well, his argument's stupid about the stupid designer, right? So, stupid's not a nice way. Remember, we're supposed to answer with kindness and gentleness and grace. Right? But yeah.
Okay, I want to talk about the bad design argument.
This is kind of long, but
Okay.
let me interject one more time. And I try to watch as much stuff as I can before we get into this sort of stuff. And so I went to, Crash Course,
Yes.
the Crash Course things that they show you all the time in school, because I use them too. I use the Crash Course European history stuff all the time, right? So so John Green's brother does philosophy and biology and all this stuff. So I watched the Crash Course on evolution, and I watched the crash course on intelligent design and all that sort of stuff. And it's, again, obviously he doesn't believe in this, and the arguments against it, again, are not strong, right? Like he goes back to William Paley. Do you know who William Paley is? William Paley is the guy who came up with the idea of the divine watchmaker. And so he said, like, if you found a watch laying in the woods and you picked it up, like immediately, what would you assume about it?
I wonder who dropped this.
So, like, this belonged to somebody, but like if you start investigating the watch, would you be like, oh, natural forces produced this? Right? You'd say this is somebody's watch, and the assumption is that someone made it, right? So that was his argument, that when we see things in nature, and that's why people always go back to like the eyeball and things like that, and they'll say like this must have been designed. But then the argument against that is people will say, well, you know, if it was designed, then like why is there a blind spot? Why do we have a blind spot? Like who designed a blind spot? And that's terrible design, right? And they'll attack things like that, which is what he's going to get into. Okay, so that's the one thing. The other thing, in the crash course video, the guy was talking about, again, evolution and how it's like a settled fact, because you look at my hand, right, and it's kind of the same thing. We have the bones, and then the hand bones, and then bones in the wrist, and then the two bones in the forearm, and then the bone in the, you know. And if you look at a bat's wing, it's designed the same way, right? The fingers are extended into the wing, but it's still there. And if you look at a whale's flipper, it's the same thing, right? So they're all there. So like low, obviously, we all came from the same, you know, single cell organism. What's the problem with that argument? That just because we have similar features means that we all evolved from a common ancestor. Is there another way that you could take that same information and interpret it?
We all are similar, so we probably all made by the same person or
Yeah,
thing.
like maybe we were made by the same designer. And he was like, oh, that works. We'll use the same design for the wing and for the
He's like
flipper and for
testing
the
it out.
hand, right?
Mhm,
We'll just, we'll stretch those out and boom, 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 like what, you know. So like, you understand what I'm saying? Like, Frank Turek has, actually, let me show you that one quick. Yeah, no, sometimes I don't think about these things. I can pull this up quick.
Can I get a tissue really quick?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, we're not at school here. You can feel free. Buffer.
What we're talking about today is this issue of science. And Steven Weinberg, who teaches at UT Austin, he's won a Nobel Prize in physics. He's an atheist. And here's what he said. I personally feel that the teaching of modern science is corrosive of religious belief, and I'm all for that. If scientists can destroy the influence of religion on young people, then I think it may be the most important
I've read this
contribution
quote to you before.
that we can make. So this guy's a professor, and he thinks science actually points away from what we would call religion or the belief in God, and he thinks that's very important to do. I actually think the exact opposite is true, that science properly understood actually points to God, but Weinberg says no, and he says,
All right, that's buffering.
Because this points to atheism. And as you know, we've been going through a series of these things that atheists say point to atheism, like reason, science, evolution, morality, and evil. Yet, are these really arguments for atheism? No, they're not arguments for atheism because they're stolen from God himself. And that's the whole thesis of the book, Stealing from God. All of these arguments or things that atheists say point to atheism wouldn't exist unless God existed. So they're stealing from God to argue against him. And
Sorry, I should have previewed those. Let me see. I don't know if I can find this one. Yes, here it is. This is good.
all right, what does science say about God? In order to do this, we have to go back 20 years to the O.J. Simpson trial. Can you believe it's been 20 years since the O.J. trial? 1995. You say, we're going to retry O.J. here? No. I just want to make a point about it, okay? Let's look at the evidence that was presented at trial. Some of the evidence. First point, Simpson's blood was found at the scene of the crime. There's only a 1 in 170 million chance it was not Simpson's blood. Secondly, Goldman, Brown, and Simpson's blood, Goldman and Brown were the two victims, and Simpson's blood was in Simpson's Bronco. You remember the white Bronco, the slow speed chase in LA, the LA freeway? All the blood was in the Bronco. Thirdly, the glove at the scene had blood from all three on it, and it matched the glove at Simpson's house. You remember when Johnny Cochran said, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit? Remember that? And the glove had dried because all the blood on it, so he couldn't put it on. Then the bloody footprints at the scene were from a rare size of size 12 shoes that Simpson owned. There was only 199 pairs of these shoes sold in the United States, and Simpson had one of them. Finally, Brown's blood was on Simpson's socks, and there's only a 1 in 21 billion chance it was not her blood, which means she was probably the only human being in the history of the world to have that blood. Now, question, does science show that Simpson was guilty? How many say yes? Science shows that Simpson was guilty.
Yes, thank you.
How many say no? How many don't want to answer? You know, the answer is no. Why? Not because I think Simpson was innocent, but because science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. All science gives you is the evidence. You have to gather the evidence and then interpret the evidence, and no evidence is self-interpreting. All evidence, all data needs to be interpreted. And so you can look at this evidence as a juror, as a scientist, and say, first of all, is this evidence good? And secondly, is it good? Does it point more toward guilt or innocence? A scientist has to do that. Science doesn't say a thing. Now, to amplify this point a little bit more, let's take a look at a survey about 10 years after the crime. They asked people whether they thought Simpson was guilty or not. 77% said, yep, he's guilty. But there was an ethnic divide. 87% of whites said he was guilty, but only 29% of blacks said he was guilty. Now, I say ethnic divide, why? Because there is no racial divide, because there's only one race, the human race. But there are different ethnicities. Now, why did two sets of people looking at the same evidence come to different conclusions? Because perhaps it's based on their worldview, their mindset. Blacks, understandably, were more apt to think the case was racially motivated. Why? Because maybe they had been victims of racism themselves and said, OJ's been set up. Whereas whites hadn't had that same experience. So when they look at the evidence, they go, OJ's guilty. Same evidence, two different conclusions. Why the difference? The mindset, the worldview. I submit to you, this is the same thing going on when scientists are arguing over where the universe came from, where life came from, where subsequent life forms came from. It's based on an argument over worldviews or mindsets. If you're somebody who's open to God, you'll look at the evidence and go, yeah, this evidence points to God. If you're a materialist, though, if you're an atheist, then you've ruled out any intelligence out there. If you think every cause is a material cause, in other words, all that exists are materials, doesn't matter how much the evidence appears to point to an intelligent being, you're going to say, no, it had to be a natural cause. You see, this is not an argument over evidence. Everyone's looking at the same evidence. You know what it's an argument over? It's an argument over philosophy or your philosophical mindset or your philosophical worldview. Because science doesn't say anything, scientists do. And you need to be aware that quite frequently when scientists interpret the data, they're actually just interpreting the data based on their philosophical worldview. They've already decided it can't be God. Why? Because they ruled God out in advance. That's why.
All right. So let's go back to my original Neil deGrasse video. Does that make sense though? I think that that is key to this whole deal. Because when you look at the evolutionary evidence, like I said, the fingers are the same, the wrists the same, the bones the same. One person says, well, that's evidence of common ancestry. The other one says, well, it's common designer. The evidence is the same. It's the way that it's interpreted that's different.
Call it the argument from bad design. This is the argument that says that actually, if you look at life in detail, although if you stand back and say, oh, there's a lot of things about life that look as though it was intelligently designed, if you look at the details, you can see hints that it wasn't, in fact, intelligently designed, that it was cobbled together by something that couldn't see what it was trying to make. And you can see why, if you think that life was put together by a blind watchmaker, not an intelligent watchmaker, you would want to argue this way. You'd want to say that, yes, there are things about life that look as though they were designed beautifully put together. They work as though an engineer put them together. But if you look at details, because an engineer didn't actually put these things together, you're going to see hints of that. You're going to see signs of that. So there's a reason that people who are taking the materialist view of life, the Darwinist view of life, are going to want to argue that although natural selection and random mutation have produced marvels, if you look at them closely, you'll see that they're not exactly the sort of marvel you would get if an intelligent designer made them.
That's what often
Now, there's
say.
two different strands of this kind of argument. One is really the broken design argument, and the other is the inept or incompetent design argument. So one looks at things like cancer and birth defects, all kinds of things that go wrong that cause death and misery, and asks whether a designing intelligence, whether God would have made life so that all of these things go wrong. And the other one says that actually the details of life suggest that something other than an intelligence put it together, that there's ineptness or strangeness in the design that no designer would have used. There are really two different arguments. And this one over here, the one that argues that there's broken things and calls into question God's motives, if you will, for making life, that's a different argument, because it's not actually arguing that God didn't make life or that life wasn't intelligently designed. It's just calling into question motives or calling into question why it would look like this if you did.
And we'll deal with that.
The other one is more correct as an argument against, or more plausible, at least superficially, as an argument against intelligent design, because it's saying you look at the details of the design itself, it shows evidence of not having been done by someone who was thinking about what he was doing. So let's consider this argument. And I have to say that in my, the examples of this argument that I've seen, there are not a large number of them, they never seem to be very high quality arguments. It's as though people are desperate to find things that they can throw out and say, well, what about this? And it's as though everyone recognizes the weight of the argument against accidental life. And that's what we've been talking about for these lessons. There's many different strands of argument you can take, all of which show that life can't be an accident. It had to have been intelligently designed. I think people who don't want to go where the weight of that argument goes are going to desperately look for things that they can throw up as counterexamples. And that's why you have this bad design argument. Okay, so a famous person who's put forward arguments along these lines, and a lot of people have done this, but Neil deGrasse Tyson gave a lecture, and I'm not sure when he gave this lecture, but if you go to YouTube and search for Neil deGrasse Tyson stupid design, you'll find a 5-minute video clip from a lecture, and he throws up on the screen.
Maybe I should do that. Just let it go. I'll catch
In
up
their
with you
stupid
talking
design, he
about
talks for about 5 minutes on what he thinks are the key examples of stupid design. There's too many of them for me to respond to all of them, but I want to pick out a couple of them just to give you a flavor of how easy it is to refute or to dismiss these arguments. The first thing, if you look at the video, to notice is he's not talking as a philosopher to a bunch of philosophers. He's not being a thinking person who's trying to convince other critical thinking people. He's instead being more a stand-up comedian delivering a stand-up comedy routine to a bunch of people who clap and enjoy his viewpoint. So he's speaking to his own choir, speaking to his own constituents. He's not really trying to convince, he's trying to entertain. And the way he speaks comes across that way. And that signals to you, if you look at the video, that probably this isn't going to be the most compelling intellectual content. One of the first things that he says is that if you put life almost anywhere within the volume of this universe, it would die instantly. Okay, and of course that's true. If you put us in outer space, we would suffocate. If you put us in the middle of the sun, we'd burn to death. If you put us in the middle of the earth, we'd be crushed and burned to death. Of course that's true, but it's not a very compelling argument. He wants to say that because most of the volume of the universe is not conducive to life, therefore you can't say that this universe was designed for life. But you could apply that logic equally to, say, a roller coaster, and say that if you put humans most places on the structure of a roller coaster, it would be very dangerous for them and they could very likely die. And therefore, roller coasters were not designed for humans. But that's complete nonsense. They were designed for humans, and they were designed for humans to be in the seat with the harness down to hold them in. All the rest of the structure is for the purpose of entertaining humans, and it is designed for the humans to be in one particular place, a very small fraction of the total places within the structure of the roller coaster, and yet it was designed for humans. So that's a simple counterexample that shows how silly the logic is. Another argument that Tyson puts forward in this 5-minute video, and one that he claims is his favorite argument, is the fact that we eat and drink and breathe and speak through one opening, the mouth. And he claims that this is an example of stupid design because it's just asking for us to choke. The fact that we eat and breathe through the same opening means we could get food lodged in the throat, in the trachea, and we could choke to death, and indeed some people do choke to death. So this has caused death, and he says it's an obvious example of something that an intelligent designer wouldn't do. He says, I'm not asking for much. If you look at porpoises, if you look at dolphins, they've got a blowhole that they breathe through, and they eat through a different opening. So they have 2 different openings, so it can be done. Why wouldn't an intelligent designer have done this with us? Okay, and for that reason, he says, that tells you that we weren't intelligently designed. But it's really a very silly argument. Let's think about this a little more carefully than he did. What are the anatomical structures that we use to eat? It's the lips, it's the teeth, it's the palate, and the tongue. Those are all well designed for eating, right? But what are the anatomical structures that we use for speaking? It's the very same structures. It's the lips, it's the teeth, it's the palate, it's the tongue. The very same structures that are used for eating are used for speaking. And speaking requires air. We have to breathe to speak. We're expelling air as we speak. So this is actually an example of elegant design. Designers, if you go and talk to the design engineers, it's considered to be very elegant design if you can use the same structures for 2 different purposes. And this is an excellent example of that. We speak and we eat with the very same structures, and we do so very elegantly. And in fact, if you look at causes of death among humans in America, there are statistics on this. Choking actually isn't in the top 10 causes of death. Number 10, of course, cancer and heart disease are the top 2 and have been for a long time. Number 10 is suicide, okay? So think about what a designer could have done if the main goal were to prevent death. The designer could have not given us a mind, because it's a mind gone wrong, a mind gone depressed that leads to suicide. So that gives you an idea for the complexity of actual design problems that Degrasse Tyson is just glossing over here. Why would God have made us without minds, as though the only goal were to keep us from dying? Evidently, that wasn't the only goal. Evidently, he has higher goals, and a mind, giving us minds, is an important part of the higher goal. And there is a cost to that. And some minds go wrong, and some minds kill others, and some minds kill themselves. Evidently, it was not the designer's purpose to prevent that from happening. Evidently, there's a higher purpose, and a mind is important for that. So that brings up a key aspect of design that Degrasse Tyson has glossed over, and that most of these arguments gloss over. And that is, design always involves the weighing of multiple objectives, and it always involves trade-offs, right? If you look at a smartphone, people and smartphone sizes have gone up and down, right? Because people, on the one hand, want them to be small enough to put in their pocket, to be easy to carry around. On the other hand, they want them to be large enough to have enough screen real estate that you can see a lot on the screen. And you can't have both, ultimately. You can't have a large screen and a small size that fits in your pocket. So there's a trade-off. And you've seen smartphone sizes go up and down because they're exploring the sweet spot in this trade-off. But there is a trade-off. And that's a very common theme in design. You have multiple objectives, there's trade-offs, and you need to hit a sweet spot where you're accomplishing multiple things well, given those trade-offs. Completely ignored and completely glossed over by Degrasse Tyson when he talks about, the problem of choking causing death. A lot of things that are a part of us are going to cause risks and are going to cause death. Evidently, the designer was willing to make us that way, and evidently that fits within his higher purpose. So that brings up an even larger sort of philosophical level of critique of the bad design argument. And that is, if we look at examples where people are competent critics of spheres of human activity, what do we see? If you watch the Olympics and you watch gymnastics, who are those judges? Are those nobodies who don't know anything about gymnastics, or are they former gymnasts and former gymnastic coaches who have lived gymnastics for decades and decades, and they know exactly what they need to be looking for when they're judging someone in gymnastics? Of course, they're experts. They have walked gymnastics for decades before they would sit as a judge looking at other people doing gymnastics. So compare that to someone like Degrasse Tyson weighing in on whether the design of life is competent or not. What has Degrasse Tyson designed? And is there anything that he has designed that he would compare to life? I haven't looked through the patent registry. I'm not sure if he's patented anything. I'm very sure of this: he has never made anything that remotely compares to life. If that's the case, then why would he think that he's in a position to offer an intelligent critique of life? Why would he be a judge of life? There isn't anyone who really is qualified to sit in that position. There isn't anyone that God would have tapped on the shoulder when he's thinking about how he's going to design things. Say, what do you think about this, Neil? Do you think this looks...
All right, you get the point. So there's one more short video that I want to show you about the creation of life from non-life. So we'll do that next time. But for next time, read the next chapter, which is chapter 6, I think, right? Yes. Yes. So read the next one, chapter 6. Can we be good without God? Right. And this one is very, very useful in everyday life. Right. So let's close with a word of prayer. Our God, Father, again, we just thank you for your creation, that it reveals you to us, that we can know about you, and we thank you, as we heard from the video, that you chose to create us and that you seek to have a relationship with us, and in order for that to happen, you sent the Lord Jesus to die on the cross to redeem us. And so we just thank you for that. We pray that everyone here would know your Son as their Savior, and we thank you for all the blessings that we have in him and because of his finished work on Calvary. And we pray that you would bless the rest of our day today, And we just pray that you would help us to be a good witness and testimony for you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.